I'm Denis Moynihan with Democracy Now! And it's great to be back in this region. I've misspent maybe some of my college years in the neighborhood. I didn't matriculate locally, but you guys know it was, I guess it was at the Science March. I had a wonderful girlfriend in college who went to Smith, and she's now a scientist, and so bumped into her and said hello at the Science March in DC that we just covered. And there's, on this, this is the publication date of the paperback edition of the book that I was honored to write with Amy Goodman and her brother David. Thanks for coming out, it was a joy to write. There's always toil associated with projects like this, and last year when it came out in hardcover, we were dealing then with candidate Trump. Things had changed. One thing I want to say, just about coming back here year after year, the depth of support that we feel from all of you for Democracy Now! Is profound. It is such a strong community. It is no accident that so much of the consistent activism and peace movement and other related movements, which we try to document in the book and on our daily work at Democracy Now!, radiates from this part of Massachusetts. We are honored, as always, to be in the company of a pillar of those movements, the intersectional organizer extraordinaire, Frances Crowe. So watch out, Donald Trump, and there's Frances has her eye on you. And I remember asking Frances a long time ago, what was your first campaign? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it was Missouri, maybe. There was a gymnasium that only boys could use. Is that true? And you fought and got access, at least to recreational facilities for girls and young women. And it was, I don't even know when that was, in the 30s. So, thanks for all you done. This event is being recorded by Amherst Media, the oldest community television nonprofit in the country, and they had a recent struggle, as always happens when activists have to confront bureaucracy or people who have mixed motives. I don't know exactly what drove the conflict, but Amherst Media is still a thriving local nonprofit media institution that's here to serve you all. So please pick up one of these flyers before you leave tonight and learn about their efforts to build and expand their work in the coming years, and it will be something that is largely dependent on the level of public support that they get. And I was also pleased to see that locally you will have like we're learning more and more around the country, a very active day of resistance on May Day coming up. So another day without immigrants, and this flyer describes all that. Shut it down on May 1st. So we like to travel and learn about all the happenings and activism and networking that goes on in the communities that we visit. And while our stops are often too short, they are informative and they inform our work, and they're very inspirational. So with that, one of the things that I do is try to organize in an old school, pre-internet clipboard style. We actually have upgraded so you can text the phrase democracy now to 66866 and accomplish the same thing that this clipboard does. But if you're like Francis and me and you know the power of the clipboard, take the Democracy Now! Mailing list and consider signing up for it. Some volunteers will be circulating them in a very anarchic manner throughout the talk, and thanks for your signing up for that. And that's how we stay in touch with you. And if a wayward prosecutor someplace in North Dakota decides to press charges against Amy Goodman, we alert people on this list that we need their support to push back.
Yeah.
And you'll hear more about that. So these events are often done, I think always done, in conjunction with some of the local institutions like Mount Holyoke, Odyssey Books, and so we're really grateful to have their support, this beautiful room. So to make further brief introductions, I'm going to hand it over to Latrina Benson from the Division of Student Life here at Mount Holyoke College. And thanks very much. Enjoy the talk, and talk to you later. See you. When we do sign, because this is the launch date of the paperback, and there are people in distant high-rise towers that monitor how ideas encapsulated in books do in the so-called marketplace of ideas, we've added an incentive. If you buy 2 books tonight, you'll get a free DVD, which is Amy's recent 90-minute interview with Noam Chomsky. So consider that as an added bit of something you can share with people and enjoy. But thanks very much, and we'll see you after the talk.
Hello everybody, my name is Latrina Benson, one of the assistant dean of students here in the Division of Student Life at Mount Holyoke. So I am going to be really brief so we can get to what you all came here for, okay? So first I still want to say again thank you for the Odyssey Bookstore for bringing this event to us in conjunction with the Division of Student Life. And just a quick housekeeping information. Books are sold like they talked about. Mount Holyoke College students, you can use your one card as usual to buy your books. Also, if you have any accessibility needs and would like for them to come and actually bring the books to you when you purchase them, we can do that as well, because we know that this isn't the best setup for those who have those particular needs. Also, I just want to remind people, no flash photography, but everything else is okay. And I just really want to thank Amy Goodman and your crew for coming. I just heard that this is your 3rd college today. So you went to Harvard, Yale, and now the best, right? Thank you so much. This is amazing to see such a great turnout from the Mount Holyoke College community as well as the surrounding community. And so now I'm going to introduce David Goodman, the brother, and then let him take it from there. So David Goodman is an award-winning independent journalist, the best-selling author of 10 books, host of the public affairs radio show, The Vermont Conversation, and contributing writer to Mother Jones, and he lives in Vermont. So without further ado, come on up, David.
Well, you know, ever since January, people have been saying, you know, what can I do? What can I do? And in this room, we have, in Francis Crowe, being in the presence of greatness here, who at age 98 has redefined the idea of acting your age. So no one here has an excuse to rest easy, at least not until you're 98, because Francis is watching. So 20 years ago, my sister Amy came home with a new project, and we'd been used to hearing a lot of new projects from Amy. She was, at that time, the news director at WBAI, the Pacifica radio station in New York, one of the largest community radio stations in the country. And Well, she came home to announce that she was going to be hosting a new election show. And it was the show, it was the election in 1996, the re-election campaign of Bill Clinton. And this was a show, was going to run for about 8 months, from February to just after the November election. And it was going to be called Democracy Now! So naturally, as her family, we like to give her unvarnished, feedback. Just move this out of the way. I told her that the name Democracy Now! Was never going to fly. I mean, that might be something that that's written on a flyer you get handed into an event, but it's not going to catch on. People aren't going to remember that. You need, and also you kind of have to be a little more stealth about it. Like the Sunday Report or the election show, or just something, really under the radar. So, well, she displayed then what she has always displayed since, which was a knack for bucking conventional wisdom, in this case, her family's opinions. Thankfully so. Because this 8-month experiment, as we know, began on a half a dozen community radio stations around the country, has now blossomed into a radio, TV, and internet phenomenon, the largest public media collaboration in the country, heard on over 1,400 stations around the world. And Democracy Now! At age 20 is alive, kicking, and raising hell. There's a reason for that, and we owe, I guess, a nod of thanks to the corporate media. Because there was a void created by the corporate media that Democracy Now! Clearly has filled. And that is the void that occurs when, instead of being a media that challenges power, you become a megaphone for power, stenographers to power. We saw that in many instances, but of course, in the recent past, in the Iraq War, in which the corporate media became part of this what we call in some of our earlier books, the propaganda two-step, in which in the case of the rollout for the Iraq War, you had Dick Cheney and his people putting out this idea that this, quote, the smoking gun will be a mushroom cloud. And first, it appears in the Sunday New York Times, that very phrase, the phrase that had been coined in the White House. Then Cheney appears on the Sunday talk shows to repeat the phrase, the smoking gun will be a mushroom cloud, but all importantly, he says, don't just take it from me, take it from the New York Times. That was in the Times just this morning. This was the incestuous relationship that existed not just then, but continues to this day. Well, somebody noticed how the corporate media works, and that somebody is a man named Donald Trump. Trump arrives on the scene a couple of years ago, and he is the perfect candidate for America's media landscape. He understands media better than the media does. His mix of theatrics and alternate facts is custom-made for a media that never challenges, that never asks those tough questions, but instead what we now know was that during the primary season, a study has been done showing that Donald Trump was given over $1 billion in retail value of free media. And that's how his world became our world. His reality suddenly becomes our reality. And, in the world of journalism, courage is not something that happens in hindsight. Courage is telling inconvenient truths, speaking truth to power when it matters. That's not a comfortable place to be in. I don't hear Amy talking about the cocktail parties she's been invited to with the rich and famous. I know that when she goes to Washington, she stood out in the rain on Saturday and during the Science March, covering the people who had come from around the country to defend science as, yeah, well, science still matters, saying just sort of weird things like that we actually have to defend. No, she wasn't invited into the C-suites and the cocktail rooms of the corporate elite. So, and part of the price you pay for that is what we have in our current book, where there's a whole section called An Independent Reporter's Rap Sheet. And it's my dear sister's criminal record for trying to put things on the record. From getting nearly killed by the Indonesian military in the early 90s when she went to cover East Timor and ended up with her colleague Alan Nairn witnessing a massacre and bringing that story to the world. Alan had his head fractured, his skull fractured by the soldiers who beat him and Amy. It was in 2008, covering the Republican convention and being thrown to the ground and arrested with their Democracy Now! Producers for simply trying to tell the story of the uprising that was taking place outside the convention floor. And it was just last year when Amy went to North Dakota to report on the Standing Rock resistance and was once again charged with a crime, and she'll talk more about that in her own remarks. So, Democracy Now! Has become the beating heart of connecting movements and change makers around the world. And it's the thing that when you tune in, whether it's live in the morning at 8 or whenever your local media broadcasts it, tells you that you are not crazy and you are not alone. Democracy Now! Has been weaving this web for more than 20 years. And I'm very proud to introduce the person who's been shining that bright light, that uncomfortable bright light, keeping us all connected and making the world a better place for all of us, my sister Amy.
Well, it is such an honor to be here with a woman who helped bring Democracy Now! To the Pioneer Valley. But it's not only that we thank Frances for, but that lifetime of commitment to being a proud activist. What can be more noble than attempting to make the world a better place? And it's a lesson that the media should learn. They tend to denigrate activists, but how important people like, not that there's anyone like Frances Crowe are. And it's such an honor to be here with you today, Frances. And to be here at Mount Holyoke and with Odyssey Books, both sanctuaries of dissent. And that's what we have to protect in these extremely difficult times. So our book tour began yesterday in Princeton, New Jersey. Today we headed, well, that was Sunday in Princeton. Yesterday, after doing the broadcast, we headed to Wesleyan College at noon, and then to the Cambridge First Parish Church to do a public interview with Noam Chomsky, which we will be airing tomorrow from Burlington, Vermont. This morning, we broadcast from Boston, and we had to change the show. We originally were going to speak with some people, including Cornel West, who we did speak to this morning, who is attempting to lead a movement to draft Bernie Sanders to start a new party and to run for president again in 2020. But we had to add someone to the top of the show, Ed Pilkington of The Guardian, because of what happened in Arkansas last night, a doubleheader, as they call it. First time in 17 years, the killing of 2 men. Arkansas is in a rush to execute as many prisoners as possible on death row by the end of April. Why? Because its supply of midazolam, which is part of an execution cocktail, will expire at the end of April. Right? It's not an issue of law and order or justice, but a drug will expire. Now, when I heard that they were going to try to execute 8 men in 11 years, 8 men in 11 days to get them in before the expiration date, at first I thought, wait a second. When a drug expires, then you're nervous that it is dangerous to consume. So they're concerned that the drug would kill these men on death row before the state executes them? Or no, it's the opposite, is it that when it expires, it won't be as effective? And that's apparently what it's all about. But that goes to a great deal of activism. Why are they so concerned? Can't they get more of this drug? First, European drug companies, and then US drug companies, have said no to their drugs being used to kill rather than to save. In Europe, the companies were deeply concerned about being associated with the Holocaust. How drugs and gas were used. Yes, Mr. Sean Spicer, the Nazis did gas Jews, millions of them. And this activism has, spread across the world. But last night, while the first 2 prisoners, their executions were stayed, the 3rd prisoner, he was executed a few days ago, and then they got in 2 last night. The first of those prisoners, they had a lot of trouble, and I'm going to the Democracy Now! Website today. It was the first time in 17 years that any state in the United States executed 2 people at once. It was 7:20 p.m. Arkansas time. 52-year-old Jack Harold Jones was pronounced dead in the death chamber at the Cummins Unit State Prison. Infirmary workers had spent more than 45 minutes unsuccessfully trying to put a central line into his neck. According to a court filing, during Jones' execution, he was moving his lips and gulping for air, which suggests he continued to be conscious during the lethal injection. Lawyers for the second man, Marcel Williams, then filed a last-minute appeal for a stay of execution following Jones's killing, arguing Williams could also experience a botched, painful death. A district court judge initially granted a temporary stay of Williams' execution, but then allowed the execution to go forward. Williams was pronounced dead at 10:33 p.m. The executions came after legal challenges reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which rejected a stay for Williams. The only justice to dissent in this ruling was Justice Sonia Sotomayor. The last double execution carried out in the United States was in the year 2000 in Texas. The first killing also went to the Supreme Court, and it was one of the first, perhaps the first decision where the new Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch weighed in a 5-4 decision. The man was put to death. So that's what happened last night in Arkansas. And it brought me back to another execution that Democracy Now! Went to cover. This was in 2011. The execution of Troy Anthony Davis in Jackson, Georgia. 2011 was a remarkable year. Democracy Now! Covers the movements changing America and the world. We started in 1996 as the only daily election show in public broadcasting. We started on 9 stations. And the show, there was more demand for it after the election that year than before. And so it just continued to grow. And on the week of September 11, 2001, terror attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, we were the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero. And so one TV station picked us up in New York that linked to the old firehouse we broadcast from, which is now a community TV station, DCTV. And they started broadcasting us as Emergency Broadcasting, Manhattan Neighborhood Network. And from that point on, more and more TV stations, public access stations, picked us up. And when radio stations would hear that we were running on their local TV station, they asked if they could run us. And then NPR stations asked if they could run us. And then PBS stations asked if they could run us. And we went from 9 stations 21 years ago to over 1,400 public television and radio stations today, with a station a week picking us up somewhere in the United States or around the world. Our headlines are also translated to Spanish, a great way to learn Spanish or English. You can put the Spanish up against the English on our website, Democracy Now! Espanol and Democracy Now! And they're also in audio form, so you can speak the Spanish as well. That broadcasts throughout the United States, Latin America, and Spain, and across the world. So Democracy Now! Has grown tremendously, and I think it's a testament to the hunger for independent voices and how critical those voices are today. Showing movements growing, that authenticity on the ground that doesn't hit the corporate media radar screen. Let's go back to 2011, that remarkable year that rocked the planet. Started in December 2010, you've got the Tunisian Revolution. A young man named Mohamed Bouazizi came out of university, didn't have any opportunity, went to sell fruit and vegetable in a marketplace. The authorities took his scales. He couldn't stand the harassment, continued, and he set himself on fire. And that was the spark of the Tunisian Revolution. That overthrew their dictator, unfortunately, who was supported by the United States, and then moved on to Egypt. Egypt, of course, that remarkable revolution, 18 days in Tahrir that toppled the dictator Hosni Mubarak. And if you tuned to Democracy Now!, you heard our colleague Sharif Abou-Quddus reporting from the middle of Tahrir, Egyptian-American, who was our senior producer for years, moved home. And Hani Massoud, who would film the interviews he did in Tahrir, also an Egyptian-American, who leaps tall buildings in a single bound, and you want him at your side when you're dealing with difficult situations. And then from Egypt to the uprising in Wisconsin, that amazing historic moment when 150,000 people took over the state capitol across the political spectrum, taking on the governor who said he was going to bust the public unions of the nurses and the teachers, but he told the police and the firefighters not to worry, he wouldn't go after them. His problem was that the police and the firefighters were married to the nurses and the teachers, and so everyone occupied the state capitol. When we got there and broadcast, I never saw anything like this. You had the Oshkosh prison guards, larger than anyone I had ever known, and I said to them, who did you vote for? And they said, Governor Walker. I said, so what are you doing here? Protesting Governor Walker. He didn't tell us he was going to do this, they said. And then the IRS agent walking in the snow, older gentleman with white hair and glasses carrying a sign, IRS auditors against Walker. And I said, well, are you Republican or Democrat? Republican, of course. So what are you doing? He said he didn't say he was going to bust our unions. And it went on from there. I remember seeing these young people in front of the governor's office in the state capitol with dreads down their back, beating on any drum they could find or drum-like, anything that they could turn into a musical instrument. And there were the police next to them rocking out. No, we don't have that in New York. And then moving on to the summer of 2011, 1,200 people encircled the White House protesting the Keystone XL. Among those who got arrested, Naomi Klein, read all her books, right? The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, and No Logo. Now she's writing a book on Trump. Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, and so many others said no to the Keystone XL. It took President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton a long time to say no, but they eventually did from that pressure. And then that moves into the fall of 2011. Well, just before, September 17, 2011, that was when thousands streamed into Zuccotti Park. That was historic. And yes, the police eviscerated the encampments not only in New York but around the country. But if you think for a moment, well, that all fizzled out. Oh, think again. Occupy, occupied the language. Now you say the 1% and 99%, and no one thinks you're talking about milk. They know exactly what you're referring to. When you change the language, you change the world. And I remember the corporate media, first they didn't cover the protests at all, even though New York is the media metropolis of the world. And then when they dealt with it, at the time Erin Burnett was starting her show on CNN called Out Front, and she said she was going to really bring you the voices of the people. I think one of her first reports was called Seriously? And it was from Zuccotti Park, and she was mocking the protesters. Now, you know, they represented so many different issues. The media would say, what do they want? Can't they decide on an issue, you know, against the death penalty, against war, and against inequality, and concerned about climate change? And I thought, oh my God, the media's actually listening. Yes, to all of those issues, people were concerned. They thought that was the weakness of the movement. I thought it was its strength. And they would say, you can't choose a spokesperson? You know, you have every different type of person. Yes, it's not a leader, it's not a leaderless movement, it's a leaderful movement. And those issues, let's take the trajectory from what happened today, let's go back in time to 2011. Among the issues, people streamed in Zuccotti carrying signs that said, too much doubt and I am Troy Davis. Who was Troy Davis? That was September 17th. So we flew from New York down to Jackson, Georgia. We did not know what was going to happen. But September 21st, 2011, Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. There had been 3 previous death warrants issued against him. Each one was stayed. We did not know what would happen, but I do believe that the media should broadcast executions. Now that may sound gruesome, but I have great faith in the American people. Most people don't realize how alone in the industrialized world we are in carrying out the death penalty. Now, in less than 1% of the cases, do people who commit murder, are they executed? In far less than 1% of the cases, or in murder cases. And so what determines who is executed and who lives? And as you can imagine, it's very much determined by the amount of money you have and the color of your skin. Actually, by the color of the victim's skin. That determines it. If a victim is white, it is much more likely that the person who is convicted of the crime will be executed. But it is very rare. And that's why we have to look at the factors that go into the death penalty. So, on that day, we flew down to Jackson to see what would happen. On September 21st, 2011, Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. We were reporting live from the grounds outside Georgia's death row in the town of Jackson, awaiting news about whether the U.S. Supreme Court would spare his life. I Am Troy Davis became a rallying cry of a growing international movement to stop his execution. The effort had grown, now included not just traditional anti-death penalty activists, but also prosecutors, prison wardens, exonerated death row prisoners, a former U.S. president, and the Pope. This is a story of a struggle against death that refused to die. Troy Anthony Davis grew up in Savannah, Georgia with his 3 sisters, his mom and his dad, who was a Korean War vet. On the night of August 18, 1989, Troy was 18, African-American, went to Charlie Brown's pool hall with a friend in the parking lot outside. Red Coles, a neighborhood tough, was arguing loudly with a homeless man named Larry Young. Several witnesses testified later. Coles pistol-whipped Young. Pool hall patrons came outside, joined other bystanders to see what was going on. Troy Davis tried to intervene in the fight, but fled when Coles threatened him with a gun. At 1:15 in the morning, Mark McPhail, a white off-duty Savannah police officer who was working as a security guard at a Greyhound station next door, came outside to break up the fight. Gunshots pierced the summer night. Moments later, McPhail lay dying with a bullet wound to the head and another to the heart. He never drew his gun. Mark McPhail was a hero cop. He was attempting to save the life of a homeless man. Red Coles, the man with the gun, who was beating the homeless man, and went to the police station with his lawyer and identified Troy as the shooter. But the day after the shooting, Troy Davis was 4 hours away looking for a job in Atlanta with his cousin. While he was there, the police launched a high-profile manhunt and splashed Troy Davis's picture across newspapers and television. Davis's panicked family alerted Troy that authorities were looking for him. His sister Martina fought for his life to the bitter end. She was a Persian Gulf nurse. She was battling breast cancer herself. She was iconic on the breast cancer vans, the mammogram vans of Savannah was her face. She was honored as a leading light with Nancy Pelosi and others, and she wouldn't stop fighting for her brother Troy. But she picked him up in Atlanta, said, let's get to the police station and clear this up. I mean, Troy was 18, and he just thought it was a case of mistaken identity. They didn't even go in with a lawyer. Troy, instead, was charged with murder. He was held for 2 years. A jury deliberated for 2 hours and returned a verdict. On August 30th, 1991, Troy Anthony Davis, age 20, was sentenced to die. Davis would spend the next 20 years on death row. During that time, 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses recanted or changed their testimony, with some of them alleging police intimidation for their original false statements. One who did not recant was the man who many have named as the actual killer, Red Coles. No physical evidence linked Troy Davis to the killing. And so let's go to that day that we went to Jackson, to the death row prison, where 100 men were on death row, 3,200 on death row around in the United States. So when you cover an event like this, we thought we'd do it like the big boys do. We got a very big satellite truck, bigger than everyone else's. We got it from Atlanta. And the satellite trucks were lined up on the edge of the prison grounds. We were wondering why, because the pen that was set up for the protesters was in a very different area. The prison would allow 150 people. That would be the leaders of human rights organizations like the NAACP and Amnesty, the family like Martina, now in a wheelchair in the last weeks of her life. And then 1,000 people were outside the prison grounds. The students from Morehouse marched, and from Spelman, the historically black colleges, and Atlanta, and they were carrying candles. People from around the world gathered. And if we were going to do this many-hour broadcast, not knowing what would happen at the end, I mean, I wasn't there just to speak myself. And we needed to be near the protesters to ask them why they would disrupt their lives to come to this place. I was very annoyed because our satellite truck, which would be rented by CNN and Fox and everyone else, was late. Finally, it pulled up on the prison grounds, and they rolled down the window and said, Miss Goodman, where do you want the van? And I said, well, the prison guards are saying you have to go to where the other trucks are. And they said, no. He said, where do you want the truck? I said, oh, my irritation was dissolving quickly. I was thinking back there at the protest pen, and they barreled over to the pen. The prison guards came running out, and to tell the satellite operators they couldn't park there, but the satellite cameramen got out of the truck, and they were bigger than the Oshkosh prison guards, not to mention the ones in Georgia, and the prison guards backed off. And then they said, where do you want to stand? I said, I was thinking of standing right by that rope so I can interview people inside the pen. And so they handed me their microphone, and they formed a kind of semicircle around me with their cameras, and they said, start the broadcast. And so we did. It was 6 o'clock Georgia time. We didn't know what would happen. Interviewing people. At 7 o'clock there was a rush through the crowd and people were actually crying, laughing, jumping on each other. They thought they heard there was a stay. You know, these things ripple so quickly like electricity, but none of that was true. The Corrections Department had given us a thin press packet. And in it, it said what Troy's schedule would be that day. He could see family in the morning, but at 3 o'clock they all had to clear out for a routine physical. Routine physical, they cared about his health on the day they would execute him. And this was not lost on the human rights leaders who gathered at the church, and Ed Dubose down the road, who was head of the Georgia NAACP, would say, so they could make sure he's physically fit, so they can strap him down, so they can put the murder juice in his arm. Make no mistake, they call it an execution, he said. We call it murder. Not long before that, a Texas man had attempted suicide on death row. They raced him to the hospital, they got him better, and then they executed him. So the other part of the press packet that they gave us detailed what Troy would have for dinner. He had turned down the special meal that a condemned prisoner gets, and so they went into detail in the press packet exactly what he would be offered. It said, grilled cheeseburgers, oven brown potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw, cookies, and a great beverage. The next page listed the lethal cocktail that would follow. It was just white page with 4 lines, like at the eye doctor when you look at that chart. It was just 4, but my dad was an eye doctor, and so I grew up with these charts, and this is what it reminded me of, except for how morbid it was. It said, pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, Ativan, in parentheses, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, the potassium chloride stops the heart. Davis refused the sedative and his last meal. By 7 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who hails from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves that's near Savannah, where Troy grew up. The Supreme Court denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53 p.m. A prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside. Time of death, 11:08 p.m. And then the eyewitnesses to the execution came out. The way an execution works, the prisoner is tied down to a cross-like gurney, strapped down by hands and legs, and then the needle is put into the prisoner's arm. They're laying in a room, and when the execution is about to begin, the curtains on the windows are drawn so that the audience can watch. And the audience consists of the family members of the murder victim, the few people the prisoner is allowed to have. Many times they are not allowed to have a guest that they choose. And finally, reporters. And so it was the reporters who came out on the grounds to report Troy Davis's final words. The AP reporter said, Troy said, I'd like to address the McPhail family. Let you know I'm not the one who killed your son, your father, your brother. I am innocent. The incident that happened that night was not my fault. I didn't have a gun. All I can ask is that you look deeper into this case so that you really can finally see the truth. He then said, I ask my family and friends to continue to fight the fight. And then he looked at his executioners and he said, for those about to take my life, God have mercy on your souls, and may God rest your souls. The state of Georgia took Davis's body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. On Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As I stood on the grounds of the prison just after Troy Davis was executed, the Georgia Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. I was reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi reportedly answered when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said, "I think it would be a good idea." But it is so important to look at what happened to Troy and to look at the increased activism today to try to stop the death penalty in the United States. And it is not only that movement, but so many other movements today. As we reach this absolutely critical period with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, at his lowest popularity ratings for any president in the history of the country at this point, in the first 100 days. Donald Trump, who calls the press the enemy of the people. I'm sort of afraid to say this, but if he would just stop attacking the press for a day or for 2 days, the press would wrap themselves around him, as they so often do, wrap themselves around the establishment. But they're getting punched so directly and so hard that you see them standing up for independent media in a way we have never seen before. And that is the silver lining, to hear them talking about the importance of the media in a democratic society. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. But so often the media has acted as the opposite. And this is what I fear. When you have a president that has such a low popularity rating, he is desperate to find an external enemy, to divert attention. Now, for Donald Trump, those enemies also exist at home. Yes, the press, Muslims, African Americans. I mean, the Muslim ban 1 and 2, stopped by, what does he call them, so-called judges? I mean, the country is engaging in a in a countrywide civics lesson. Little kids, adults, and the President of the United States himself. Yes, there are 3 co-equal branches of government, and one can be a check on the other. He is the CEO of a real estate empire and continues to be. I was interviewing Noam Chomsky last night, and I didn't get to ask the question, but as a linguist, a world-renowned linguist, I wanted him to define the word kleptocracy. But you have, the president meeting with the president of China, Xi Jinping, someone he has vilified, a country he has gone after, and his daughter is at his side, Ivanka Trump. And then we learned that very day that they're dining in Mar-a-Lago that she got 3 exclusive clothing patents for her goods in China. This is terrifying. When you think foreign policy is being conducted to enrich a very small circle of intimate family who also are related by their business connections. I'm not sure which one is more important. But when you have a president who attacks the press in the way he does and attacks the people he has vilified for so long. I mean, this Muslim ban goes way back. He's a leader of the birther movement, right, against President Obama. You may have many criticisms of President Obama that are so justified. He said he would close Guantanamo after a year. That didn't happen. The expansion of the drone wars, the expansion of wars in the Middle East. But not being born in the United States cannot be one of them. The racism implicit in he does not look like us. Donald Trump leading that movement years before he was running for president. The implicit racism, and then saying that he's Muslim. What are we supposed to say then? How could he be Muslim? No, he's not Muslim, as if there is a problem with being Muslim. But, the father of fake news, it takes one to know one. So the media attacks back as it should. But the way he can rally the troops and the journalists is by attacking another country. And that's what we have seen as he revs up against North Korea. You know, you can hear the crazy words of a dictator in North Korea that have been going on for years. They just have not been amplified because the president and the administration doesn't take them seriously. But if you actually listen to them, if they're put out one after another in a day, you'll say there is reason to be very afraid. And if he amplifies this and increases the pressure against North Korea, now that's what's happening abroad. And at home, just to follow up on the Muslim ban and the so-called judges, Donald Trump getting stopped by men and women in black robes has infuriated him. And so he issued another Muslim ban. Instead of 7 countries, 6 countries. And Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General of the United States this week, speaking on a right-wing radio talk show, says, how is it that a man on an island in the Pacific can stop the President of the United States? He's the head of the Justice Department. He's asking this question. I thought, you know, this might encourage the sovereignty movement in Hawaii, who never wanted to be a part of the United States. Maybe Jeff Sessions is on their side. So you vilify people at home, and you isolate countries, and you bomb them. I mean, Syria, after the horror of the gas attack, of course it needs to be investigated as to who was involved with it. The US decided, President Trump decided, to hit an old military base in Syria with 59 Tomahawk missiles. Made by Raytheon, which he invests in. At least that's the last documents we have on some of his investments. So he makes money on these hits. And he himself talked about how this happened while he was having a wonderful chocolate cake at Mar-a-Lago with the Chinese president. Really good chocolate cake. I'm not sure if the chocolate cake was huge or not, but it was delicious, he said. And that's what you can get at Mar-a-Lago if you pay $200,000 a year. I mean, the advertising, and now apparently the State Department has been forced to take off an advertisement for Mar-a-Lago as the winter White House because it is so self-serving, the kleptocracy. But most importantly, is the media rallying around the president when he drops bombs. Whether it's the bombing of Syria, and make no mistake about it, the U.S. has been bombing before and after that time, killing innocent civilians. But this was the first time directly against the Assad government, though they started to fly planes like the next day from that airfield. And then dropping the mother of all bombs, named so by the Pentagon, the Moab, the massive ordnance air blast bomb that has a radius of 1 mile, the largest non-nuclear bomb in the world. Within weeks of the Trump administration, he's dropped it, daring to do what Obama wouldn't do, what Bush dared not do, though Bush did develop it, and Trump just drops the bomb on Afghanistan. And the media from Syria to Afghanistan says this is what's made him president. We need a media that questions war. Imagine if war were not an option. Just think about that. Think about the pundits you get on television, these know-nothing pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. We need a media that is not brought to us by the weapons manufacturers when we cover war. We need a media that's not brought to us by the oil, gas, and coal companies when we cover climate change. We need a media that's not brought to us by the insurance industry and big pharma when we cover healthcare. That's what independent media is all about. Which brings me me back to the origins of Democracy Now! We started at Pacifica Radio, though now on these 1,400 television and radio stations around the world, this amazing network born out of World War II, a war resister named Lou Hill, who came out of the detention camps and said, we need a media outlet that is not brought to us by corporations that profit from war, but by journalists and artists. And so KPFA was born in Berkeley in 1949, KPFK born in Los Angeles in 1959, my station in New York, WBAI, in 1960. In the first year of operation, WBAI was broadcasting a debate between James Baldwin and Malcolm X over the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience, the effectiveness of the lunch counter sit-ins. 1977 WPFW in Washington, 1970 KPFT in the Petro Metro of Houston. That's the 5 Pacifica stations. Yes, they made their name, sadly, and they didn't do it themselves. In the first weeks of operation, KPFT in Houston, it was in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. The Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. And I thought Arlo Guthrie's song was a good one. And then a few weeks later, they got back on the air and they strapped 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it up again. It took months then to rebuild KPFT. In January of 1971, the media came and broadcast the moment the phoenix rose from the ashes. Arlo Guthrie came into Houston to finish his song live on the air. And KPFT has been broadcasting ever since. Now, I don't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, dangerous independent media is, dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it is an uncle in Iraq or an aunt on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota. Thank you, Denis. You begin to understand where they're coming from. And I didn't say agree with them. How often do we even agree with our family members? But you begin to understand at least why they say what they say. That understanding is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back. Now, this weekend, before we started the book tour, we broadcast 5 hours from Washington, D.C. at the National Mall next to the Washington Monument for the March for Science. How many of you were there or maybe marched in town here? It was amazing. Hundreds of thousands of people marched around the globe on every continent, marching for science. And I'm looking for some of the signs. There was this woman who was holding a big sign that said, "I'm with her," with an arrow to Mother Earth. There was the sign, "Ice has no agenda, it just melts." And another one, "There's no planet B." And then there was Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, amazing woman, Iraqi-American doctor, pediatrician, associate professor at Michigan State, runs the pediatrics or the pediatric residency program at Hurley Hospital in Flint. She's the one who blew the story about the lead contamination of the children wide open. She was just a doc in Flint, treating children, and then an unelected city manager makes this fatal decision, chosen by the Republican governor of Michigan. Do you know at a certain point in the last few years, half of the African-American cities of Michigan were under unelected control? Oh, sure, you can elect your little city councils and your mayors, but they will answer to an unelected manager, and they will call the shots. And even when the city council of Flint said no to disconnecting from the Detroit water supply, very clean, very sure, they'd had it for over 50, 80 years, and you will link up to the Flint River. Now, people lived in Flint. They knew how disgusting the Flint River was. But this was mandatory. And so they delinked from their water supply, clean, healthy, and they started taking water from the corrosive Flint River, to the great horror of the population, yes, majority African American, of Flint. And the children drank this water, and Dr. Moynihan at Tisha crunched the numbers. I know after a few years, the horror and the deliberate poisoning of an American city, that is a major charge to make. We went to Flint, we did a documentary, The Poisoning of an American City, Thirsty for Democracy. But we interviewed folks at the Flint General Motors plant. There's an engine head factory there. Very quickly, very early on, they realized once the water supply was switched that the engines were corroding. They were also linked up to the Flint River, and they couldn't sell corroded engines. And so they appealed to the unelected city manager for a waiver. They said, we have to disconnect or we can't sell these engines. And they got the waiver so that they could reconnect to the Detroit water supply. So the unelected manager fully well knew, and there are the workers in the plant, glad they have their jobs, that the engines aren't corroding, but what about inside them? They lived in Flint. So they knew early on. And when the Flint City Council said no by an overwhelming decision in the range of 7-1 or something to this change, the unelected city manager said this was an irresponsible decision. And when he left, oh, by the way, he's been indicted since then, as has the unelected manager before, but that doesn't mean the pipes have been changed. When he left, said, not so fast, guys. You may be happy that I'm gone. You cannot reverse any decision I made for a year. And so they lived with this. Dr. Moynihan at Tisha starts to see problems. She crunches the numbers. She said, I didn't wait for any peer-reviewed journal where I could make my name, and I would have. I held a news conference, and I said, this is horrifying. What I'm seeing is happening to our children, and this is permanent. Oh, the Michigan governor and the city officials, the state officials started to vilify her, but they couldn't win. This woman stood up. She was standing on the stage at the March for Science, and I talked to her after in the pouring rain, which didn't dampen anyone's spirits. She's just written an op-ed piece in the New York Times with an Iraqi. Where will the next Iraqi-American doctor come from to blow open a Flint scandal with the Muslim ban? She said if her family had not been allowed into this country, remember in the first Muslim ban it included Iraq, she could never have helped save the lives of so many thousands of children in Flint. All of these issues are connected. It doesn't weaken the case, it only strengthens it. So those were some of the voices from the March for Science. And now, April 29th, we'll be in Washington for a 5-hour broadcast. Check it out at democracynow.org, and any media can run it. We always say, steal this story, please. 10 to 3 next Saturday, we'll be broadcasting from the People's Climate March in Washington. Now I want to talk about those who are fighting for the fate of the planet around climate change. The Standing Rock Sioux in North Dakota, and the amazing struggle they have waged. April 1st, 2016, that was the day LaDonna Brave Bull Allard said, come, I open my property to you, to the Native Americans at Standing Rock and other places along the Cannonball River, this magnificent view. She opened up the sacred stone resistance camp and said, resist with me. Even before the tribe officially agreed to this, she said, We cannot allow our water to be contaminated. And so they built this resistance camp, and hundreds of people flocked to it. It got so full they had to build another camp and another, and the teepees came, and the people came. It's the largest unification of Native Americans in decades, from Latin America, from the United States, the First Nations of Canada. An astounding gathering with thousands of non-Native allies as well. And they said no to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline owned by Energy Transfer Partners that would be built from North Dakota, taking the fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields through South Dakota, through Iowa, through Illinois, and then hook up with a pipeline down to the Gulf of Mexico. And they said no to reliance on a fossil fuel economy that will kill us all. And they said, we're not only protecting the water for ourselves, but the 17 million people downstream who would rely on the largest river in North America, the Missouri River. They don't call themselves protesters. They call themselves water protectors. And they amassed, and they fought back. And the sheriffs militarized. I mean, this is what recycling looks like in America. You take the old weapons and tanks from Afghanistan and Iraq, and you give them to the police departments of the United States so that they too think out there is the enemy, but out there is all of you. I think of Norm Stamper. We just had him in the studio in New York, the former police chief of Seattle, the one who presided over the basically police riot of 1999 when the police went after the protesters against the World Trade Organization. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people were arrested and gassed and pepper sprayed. And he says it was the worst mistake of his life. He said he just bought it, hook, line, and sinker. Those people out there are the enemy. And who were those people? His neighbors. They were the high school kids in their political science classes. They were the nurses, they were the economists, they were the doctors, they were the farmers, all gathered from all over the world in his neighborhood. And he said, I attacked them. And he warns police departments now all over, you've got to stop seeing your own populations as the enemy. And that's exactly what's happened in North Dakota. These militarized sheriff's departments wearing their RoboCop gear that sets them apart, just like we saw in Ferguson when people were protesting the killing of an innocent young African-American man, Michael Brown. We see the same thing in North Dakota. And soon scores of people were being arrested, then hundreds of people were being arrested. This is election year of 2016. All of this is happening. Did one of those, I don't know if you can call them journalists, who run the debates with the presidential candidates, did one of those news personalities ask a presidential candidate about climate change? No. In the final general election, did they ever ask one question about climate change? The networks will say people aren't interested. Really? I mean, you had the thousands of people gathering in North Dakota. So we went there late. I mean, we were covering it before this, but we actually got there on the ground late, in Labor Day weekend. Democracy Now! Went to North Dakota, and we covered the ceremonies and the protests. What the water protectors do, in fact, it's interesting to see this glass of water, because they go up against the RoboCops of the sheriff's department, and they offer them water. They say, this is not only for us, it's for you. We're protecting it for your children. Have some. And that's how they protest. They protect. And we were covering all of this. And then Saturday came, of Labor Day weekend. We followed a group of Native Americans who were going to plant their tribal flags in an area they said was sacred burial ground. Now, this was in dispute. And they had brought suit, and a judge was going to rule the following week after Labor Day. And the judge asked for the tribe, the Standing Rock Sioux, to give him a map of where their burial mounds were, and that's what they did. And then the judge, the day before Labor Day, gave that over to the Dakota Access Pipeline. And on Saturday, when we got there, the tribes were coming up on this land. They didn't expect the dapple bulldozers to be working over the weekend, and there they were at full tilt. They'd leapfrogged from where they were far away to the very area they designated in this map. So whatever the judge ruled the next week, the facts on the ground would change. They were destroying the sacred ground. And the people were incredibly upset, and women and their children were running up on the property, standing in front of the bulldozers. This is amazingly brave, because these bulldozers are dangerous. You don't realize when they're moving mounds of earth how you can get crushed. Ask the family of Rachel Corrie, who stood up March 16, 2003 in Gaza, in Rafah, protecting a pharmacist family's home that was going to be destroyed by a bulldozer. She stood with that big orange, you know, what the traffic guys use, standing with the international solidarity movement to stand with and bear witness to the Palestinian struggle. And she, standing in front of this bulldozer built by Caterpillar, used by the Israeli military, was crushed by the bulldozer. And I thought about that as I saw these women and children. The bulldozer was moving mounds, but they pushed the bulldozers back. It was amazing. They started withdrawing. And then the dapple guards, go to access pipeline guards, unleashed dogs on the Native Americans. Dogs. And they bit them, they bit their horses. And the guards, even the dogs, would pull back. And they would throw them into the crowd. They'd bite their way out. We filmed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with Native American blood. We posted that video that night on Facebook. Remember how the corporate media said people don't care? Within 24 hours, there were something like 14 million hits on this video. Yeah, people cared. We went back to New York. The judge's decision was coming out on Friday. It didn't look good for the tribe, and Governor Dalrymple, then the governor of North Dakota, Thursday night announced he was calling out the National Guard. Oh, and then the authorities issued an arrest warrant for me. Now, this was a little surprising, and I didn't know about it. So we were broadcasting from New York. And the next day, the judge did rule against the tribe. And the Justice Department lawyers who had prevailed were about to pop their champagne corks. They'd won a big case. Now, that week, Obama was in Asia. President Obama was in Laos for the first time, and he was holding a democracy forum for young people. And young people come from all over. And the last question came from a young Malaysian girl. And she raised her hand and said, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? She had asked a question no American journalist had asked of President Obama. And he actually was very eloquent about the oppression of Native Americans in the United States. And then he said about DAPL, I'll have to get back to you on that. I have to check with my team. And he came back to the United States that week, right before the judge ruled, right after Labor Day. And word has it, he saw the video of the dogs. What did Winona LaDuke say that day that the dogs were unleashed? You know, the Native American activist leader who, from the White Earth Reservation, northern Minnesota. She said, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama, 1965. We are through. So 15 minutes after the Justice Department won, an unprecedented 3-agency letter from Justice, I guess there were different lawyers higher up, the Army Corps of Engineers and the Department of Interior issued a letter that said they were stopping the pipeline for now. Clearly coming from the White House, this coordinated letter. So for now, they wanted to look at whether there was Native American participation in the decisions, whether there's environmental impact statement. This was all, I mean, the Native Americans were reeling. First, a horrid decision was wiping them out. And then this very same entities that went after them, the Justice Department was saying, no, we're gonna hold on. So on Friday, right after the decision, we were headed to Toronto because the Toronto International Film Festival invited us to speak after a film was premiering called All Governments Lie. You see, it's about I.F. Stone and his history, the great muckraking journalist, and he told journalists, young students, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. If you're going to remember 3 words, all governments lie. And so then they were talking about independent media today, like Democracy Now!, like Matt Taibbi at Rolling Stone. So we all went up to speak after the film, and the next day at the University of Toronto, and I thought I would go up because, you know, people in Canada care about First Nations. Everyone wanted to hear about North Dakota. And at University of Toronto the next day, in the middle of my talk, just like tonight, I got a text, and it said, "You're under arrest." I was in the middle of a talk, and I looked down, and it said, like, "There's an arrest warrant for you." It was coming from a number I did not know, and I thought, what is this? But I didn't say anything to the audience because I thought this was extremely alarming because I was in Canada. And, you know, if there's an arrest warrant for you, you won't necessarily be picked up right away. You have to interact with police or FBI or border guards. And if they see it's in the system, and I had to come home. So I just said, you know, when someone call me a cab, I have to go to the airport. I know this is a little early. I had planned to finish my talk, but I just need to go home. And I made my way to the airport. I did get home before. I thought if I could get home before this arrest warrant went into the system, figure out what was going on. But I really didn't take it personally once I got home, because I figured this was a warning to all journalists. Do not come to North Dakota. And that's exactly why journalists needed to go to North Dakota, so we had to challenge this. Especially, I felt, for young journalists. They'll be afraid to go. They don't have the resources. You know, they want to go cover something. They can't end up in jail. So we had to call their bluff. A few weeks later, we fly back to North Dakota. We'll do a national, global broadcast from the jail and the courthouse. So I was going to have to turn myself into the jail, so we'd broadcast in front of the jail, and then at the end of the show, I'd turn around and go into the jail. We flew in. As we landed in Bismarck, the prosecutor dropped the charges. I mean, it couldn't sustain. They said that they didn't have a case. But then he said he was bringing new charges, riot charges, and I could end up in jail for a year. This was this Friday in October. So we covered the protests all weekend, which were amazing. I mean, by then, hundreds and hundreds of people had been arrested. And on Monday, we went to the courthouse to do our broadcast at 7 in the morning. We broadcast at 8 Eastern Standard Time. But we broadcast 7 North Dakota time, so it was dark. And we broadcast from in front of the jail and the courthouse, which are next to each other. And there's just a monument, a stone 10 Commandments between them on the property. So it's the courthouse, the 10 Commandments, and the jail of Manda. And we broadcast just directly across on church property. And I interviewed the chair of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, Dave Archibald, who himself had been arrested on low-level misdemeanor charges protesting. He was strip searched. He was put in an orange jumpsuit. These are for low-level misdemeanors. Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, the pediatrician on the reservation, who was one of the first to be arrested in the summer because she cared about the health of the children on the reservation. She was strip searched. She was put in an orange jumpsuit for low-level misdemeanor. I mean, the level of humiliation of Native Americans. And we talked to Winona LaDuke, and we're sitting across from the courthouse, waiting for the arraignment that afternoon when I'd have to go into the courthouse. Hundreds of Native Americans came to show their support, but now the global media spotlight was, will the judge sign off on these charges to allow me to be arraigned? And when there was that much pressure, he refused to sign off, and the charges were dropped. And those Native Americans who were going to court that day for misdemeanor and felony charges also had their charges dropped. This is why that spotlight is so important. I believe in reality television, but I'm talking actual reality. What people face on Grant. September, the Obama administration said, we'll review this. December 5th, they ruled they would not grant that final permit under the Missouri River. And Donald Trump became president, and in one of his first acts, granted the permit and said the Keystone XL would again be revived, both DAPL and the Keystone XL. What we see in Washington is the rise of the oligarchy. You have the Secretary of State is Rex Tillerson, the former head of the largest oil corporation in the world, ExxonMobil. You have, the head of the EPA, Scott Pruitt, the former Attorney General of Oklahoma, a land that is now a land of earthquakes. Earthquakes! Oklahoma had almost never known an earthquake. And why? Because of the intensive fracking of that state. This man sued the EPA 14 times now. He's the head of it. And then you have Governor Perry of Texas, who becomes the Secretary of Energy. When he stepped down as governor, oh, by the way, he was bankrolled for his 2 presidential campaigns to the tune of $6 million by Kelsey Warren, who's the CEO of Energy Transfer Partners that owns the Dakota Access Pipeline. And when he stepped down as governor, he immediately went on the board, Governor Perry, of Energy Transfer Partners, only stepped down to become Secretary of Energy, the oligarchy. But you also have the resistance, like you're going to see this weekend in Washington and in cities and towns all over this country, like you saw the day after the inauguration. Yes, the women who marched, their crowd was much larger than President Trump's the day before for his inauguration. We have not seen anything like this in a sustained way. The massive numbers of people went to the airports from JFK to Dulles to Los Angeles. I mean, you had senators and judges being manhandled and roughed up at the airports. And so what we are seeing is great forces coming to a head. Yes, you have the man who occupies the position of president, which is the most powerful position on earth. But you have a force more powerful, which is the people. And I really do believe that those who care about war and peace, those who are concerned about the growing inequality in the world, those who are concerned about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not a silent majority, but the silenced majority by the corporate media. But now they are able to be heard. Yes, it's our job to go to where the silence is as journalists, but it is not silent there anymore. It's just up to the corporate media and all of the media to broadcast what is percolating up from the grassroots. And so I wanted to end with a statement by a young college student at the Durban UN Climate Summit. You know, Democracy Now! Covers all the summits from Doha, Durban, Paris, Peru, Poland, Copenhagen. We started in 2009. And it was in Durban, South Africa in 2011 that Anjali Appadurai from College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, was asked by many youth to represent them inside the UN Climate Summit. You know, so much doesn't happen at these climate summits, but it's the people outside that mean so much. The student from the Maldives who said, "You're going to drown my country." Yes, the people of sub-Saharan Africa who said, "You're cooking our continent." And Anjali Appadurai, who stood up before the 1,000 delegates, world leaders, scientists, bureaucrats, and said to them, "I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all of my life. You've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The starkest betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition? Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. She said, there is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. And then she quoted Nelson Mandela, who said, it always seems impossible until it's done. And so she concluded, distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now, get it done. When Anjali finished, the acting president of the COP, the Conference of Parties, the UN Summit, even said, on a purely personal note, I wonder why we not let speak half the world's population first in this conference, but only last. And she was hailed by all as a visionary, as a young person who might just save the planet. The following year, we bumped into her in Doha. She wasn't inside the summit, she was outside, and I asked Anjali, are you coming in? And she said, no, I've been banned. But this really is the hope. And I just want to end by telling one last quick story. And then Denis and David and I will sit down and we'll sign books. You don't have to get a book to come up. And by the way, if you get 2 books, as Denis said, you get this wonderful Noam Chomsky DVD. It's wonderful to be here with Odyssey Books. We're trying to push this book up the list to make it into the New York Times, which rarely covers Democracy Now!, but here it would be not because they want to, but just the numbers. And why does it matter? It shows the publishing world that people care about alternative ideas, about this independent universe of media that we want to bring to people around the country. And once it gets on that list, libraries get the book and universities get the book, and it makes an enormous difference and opens up a space for other people to write books that are not your, just reinforcing the status quo, but raising critical questions. My brother David and I wrote a book called Static, and the reason we called it that is, in this high-tech digital age, amazingly, with high-tech television and digital radio, still all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths. Well, what the media needs to give us is the dictionary definition of static. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate and not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. So, this final... March for Science, so many people were wearing a button that said, science, not silence. And that's where I want to end. I want to go back to World War II, to a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians, and they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And they thought the best we can do is to get out information so the Germans will never be able to say we didn't know. So they put out a series of pamphlets. On the 4th pamphlet was written the words, we will not be silent. And they distributed these everywhere. Under cover of dark, they distributed them in alleyways and marketplaces and schoolyards. Then Hans and Sophie and their professor, who encouraged them, were captured by the Nazis. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now!